Thank you, Thibaut. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us. It's really an honor and pleasure to share some of our findings and practical experience this morning. So I'm gonna cover briefly, because we are still through one of the worst droughts in the history of the state of California. I like to set that baseline and do kind of a review of where we are in terms of water at the state level. So that's what I'm gonna start with, and then as Thibaut alluded to, I will show you some of our research findings in terms of winter drought. To finalize with a quick summary of different methods that we use today and that we have used through the last probably 10 years at Gallo in terms of estimating water stress and related issues. For example, estimating on a micro scale and a large scale vine growth through several thousand vineyards. Obviously, keep in mind that I won't really allude to a specific vineyard. As a big company that we are, we have to work with many different scenarios, and that will come through my presentation. So when we talk about overview of the current situation, the first thing I wanted to allude was, yes, we did get one of the wettest Decembers ever. So we got quite a bit of rainfall during the month of December. So what the pictures here show is on the left what we got, on the right normal precipitation for that October to January 11th time frame. So you can see how we got above average or above normal rainfall for that particular time, right? So that's great news, but unfortunately, because we've been through drought for the last 3-4 years, we're still very, very far behind. So we still have a lot of room, a lot of work to do to catch up in terms of rainfall. The state is 80% of the state is under severe drought, as classified by the USDA drought index, and that's what is shown on the map. What it's even more worrying is the snowfall received this year than the last 2 years. So far, we are between 20 and 40% of normal in terms of snowfall. So not only we are still below average for rainfall, but we are very, very below average for snowfall, right? And think about all the consequences of receiving less snowfall, especially for a state as California that really needs all that water flow coming from the mountains to fill up reservoirs and to also feed the big cities, right? So these days we're not just talking about irrigating vineyards, but we are competing with other crops and we are competing with urban consumption, right? So the state of California, I think, is going to have to make some tough choices in the next few years in terms of water allocation. Definitely, 2014 we saw 0% water allocation throughout the state. The last numbers that I've seen for 2015 are at best 5% allocation in terms of water. And that basically means the reservoirs are still very, very empty, so to speak, right? And I was going to use below average term, but they are really, really empty. So it's kind of scary to drive through one of these big reservoirs and see how far below average these things are. At best 30-40% of where we should be by this time of the year, and much less in terms of average for the last 3, 4, 5 years, right? But one concept that I do want to mention as well is that, like I said before, we are not just thinking about how much water we add to our vineyards, because I think to one of the concepts introduced by the guest speaker in terms of dry farm and so on, and I don't want to really get into the discussion of dry farm is good or not, but the way we're going, we are not going to have the same amount of water we had today 10 years from now, likely, right? And I don't mean to go into the whole global change, global warming discussion as well, but I think we are going to have to make some tough choices. The state really is going to have to legislate in terms of groundwater levels, monitoring, reporting back to the state. There are some things coming down the pipeline for all of us, not just the Central Valley, the warmer areas, but the coast as well. Think about also water needed for frost protection, for example, right? It's not just water for irrigation. And all those things, as we keep seeing drier and drier years, less rainfall and less snowfall, all that is gonna have an impact on all of us, right? And however, our urban water use has not declined. So even last year, through the worst drought ever in the state of California, and with all the publicity, it was every single day in the news, many articles talking about the need to conserve water, to be more efficient, irrigating our lawns and washing our cars and all that. You still see most of the big cities down in Southern California even use more water last year than ever before, right? And through the state is the same thing. And I don't mean to criticize, obviously, urban water use, but as a reality check for all of us, that's what we're competing with. The amount of water available for agriculture is going to be a function of not just rainfall and snowfall, but how much water is used in the state for feeding population, basically, so to speak, right? So definitely, everything that is going to come after in my presentation and all the technologies, tools that we're gonna have to use in the vineyard, they are going to play even a more significant role. And I think that's where I see fruition coming really into play, because we know that what we're used to doing, the way that we are used to farming grapes throughout the state, is likely going to have to be tweaked somehow, right? What is the forecast for the next 3 months? And this was updated, I believe, January 15, yeah. Well, the forecast in terms of drought is not looking that pretty either. We know that the remaining of the month of January is going to be pretty dry. There's not that much of a probability to get significant amounts of rainfall in January. And for the following 2 months, we are likely going to be below average as well. So the drought is, at best, maybe not getting worse, but likely will. So now that I scare you all, now let's go to see what happens when we completely eliminate rainfall. And again, as Steve alluded, we started this way back in 2009, 2010. I had the opportunity to do my PhD at the University of Adelaide in Australia, and talk about a country that has had to deal with severe water restrictions for the last 10, 15 years, right, where really the growers had no water whatsoever. So it was really a privilege to do that, and I always had to thank Dr. Nick Ducuslian and Dr. Luis Sanchez, who is here on the audience, by the way, for having that long-term view, right, of, well, back in 2009, a lot of people, even internally at Gallo, when we were starting to think about doing this research, they were, well, why are we going to spend all this money doing this research when back then we still had, pretty good amounts of rainfall, snowfall, and we always maintained that when you are doing research, you have to look long term, right? And we kind of saw it coming, and look where we are today. So the first thing that I'm gonna show you is an experiment. Again, it was done 4 years actually, but I'll focus really on the first 2 years. And what we did was we deployed these tarps, basically plastic films, and this is a vineyard in the Central Valley, so it's just to begin with, drier than the areas where we are, Napa, Sonoma, a lot drier, right? And we did it in Merlot, by the way, which is a highly susceptible cultivar to water stress because of the lack of vigor, by nature, so to speak. So we built these tarps, and again, there was a lot of effort and a lot of money invested on keeping these tarps up during the entire winter. That meant that the middle row that you see there did not receive any amount of rainfall during the entire winter. And back then we did it actually because the company had a really significant interest on understanding not only what will happen if we didn't get any rainfall, but also on what happened with a hot topic back then and even still here today in terms of methoxyparacins, so bell pepper-like characters in Merlot and Cabernet. That has been published, by the way, so you can go read. There's 3 papers that came out of that entire research. But the first thing we saw is a significant reduction in vine growth. And again, I do want to stress this point that during the season we irrigated all the vines, right? So the only difference was what happened before bud break. So one treatment had absolutely no rainfall whatsoever. The other one, was exposed to normal conditions. And in 1 year that we did not get normal rainfall, we actually installed sprinklers to make sure that the soil was moist as if we had got normal rainfall. During the season, when we hit a stress level threshold, we irrigated, drip irrigated basically all the vines. But needless to say, when you do drip irrigation, that's one of the problems or the challenges of drip irrigation. You're only wetting a small portion of the soil, right? You're not wetting the entire rooting system. So especially on a cultivar, low vigor cultivar by nature like Merlot, the first thing we saw right off the bat on that following spring and summer is that no matter how much we will irrigate, the vines will not respond. Basically, the significant decrease in shoot growth was there. And obviously, I don't need to tell you which treatment is what. There on the right, you have the vines that did not get any rainfall. On the left, you have the normal rainfall treatment, so to speak. And as a consequence of that, we also saw a significant reduction in yield on cluster size, on berry size, also on the number of clusters developed. Even in the first year, which was really shocking to us, we expected maybe the first year we could get away, with things like that. But even at the first year, and again, it's a very extreme situation where you had absolutely no rainfall on a very low vigor cultivar. But you can see how yield was decreased significantly, 40% on the first year, 50, 60% and so on in consecutive years. And again, I'm showing you basically the first 2 years. After 2010, 2011, 2012, basically we completely removed the tarps and we let those vines exposed to normal rainfall conditions, and we actually overwater. I'm not going to go into that data right now, but you had to take my word. It didn't matter. Those vines still struggle, and if I take you to that vineyard today, you could still see which vines back in 2009 and 10 did not receive any rainfall, regardless of how much water we applied now through the drip, right? In terms of wine sensory, and I decided to focus more on wine sensory versus wine quality, but wine quality, and you got to put this in perspective, right? So this is a Central Valley vineyard where before we started the experiment, the vines were more than likely a little bit overgrown because, the farmer obviously was going for higher yields. So the first year actually, quality improved a little bit. We got more concentration, basically smaller berries, more astringency. That was sort of positive, although the reduction in yield was, again, 40%. Obviously, for Central Valley vineyards, that's not acceptable. But in year number 2, that basically flipped, and we concluded we didn't do any cluster thinning, by the way. And again, to the point made by the speaker, the first speaker, what we saw here is the long-term cluster thinning becomes even more important, right? As you go into more restrictive situations, and this is probably the worst, where you have absolutely no rainfall, is that you really had to go and drop a lot of those clusters and those vines, because otherwise the canopy could not ripen the crop, right? The canopy developed was just not big enough to ripen that crop. So there's a severe lack of vine balance. And you can see that by the leaf area to pruning weight ratio, basically, to yield ratio, sorry. So in terms of methoxyparacins or green aromas, needless to say, there was a reduction because of higher water stress and the clusters being more exposed because of smaller canopies, smaller leaves as well too. But again, that all became irrelevant when we saw year number 2, number 3, number 4. That really the canopies that we were able to develop were not big enough to actually ripen the crop. And keep in mind that I'm telling you, we did not do any cluster thinning. And that's why we conclude that cluster thinning becomes really, really important when you go into this type of situation. Much more, of course, if you go into dry farming. So I'm gonna cover in the last 5 minutes some of the methods that we have since implemented to kind of in some cases get an overview of what's going on real time in all our vineyards. And when I say all our vineyards across the state, not just obviously Central Valley, but Napa, Sonoma, the Central Coast, some cases outside the state as well. This is one example of a tool that wasn't developed by us, by the way. It's developed by a partnership between NASA and CSU Monterey. This is available to any of you guys. It's a medium resolution satellite imagery, so 30 meters. So again, not suitable perhaps for precision viticulture, but it gives you kind of an idea of what's going on, how your canopies are developing. It's free, so anybody can subscribe to this. You get an account, a login, password, and you get basically weekly or bi-weekly, every other week basically updates as NASA downloads new pictures from the satellite. You'll get it real time, and you can access it also through a mobile device. So it's pretty good for what you're paying, which is really nothing. In terms of remote sensing, we also implemented a lot of these energy balances approaches, and what this does is, again, is basically takes into consideration all the sources of energy, so incoming radiation absorbed by the leaves, radiation absorbed by the ground, and then it calculates it or estimates evapotranspiration. And evapotranspiration has been, a technology or a methodology used for the last 20 years in California. In some cases, one of the failures of that ET model has been the adoption of generic crop coefficients, right? Crop coefficients that were developed somewhere else, in Fresno, in the Central Valley, where canopies are much larger. Obviously you could not use any of those numbers for your situation here in Napa. So this approach through remote sensing energy balance really gives you kind of a site-specific crop coefficient when you do all these things. In terms of tracking changes in vegetation, and I'm just showing a simple NDVI, which obviously you all seen a million times. It's again another opportunity for us to track at a large scale, how things are developing. And you can see there a wet dry versus a dry year, a wet year versus a dry year, wet year on the left, dry year on the right. The difference is on NDVI on the same vineyards. And again, you have to take my word for this, but on the dry year, the grower applied 50% more irrigation early on through the drip. Still, the vines didn't develop, right? And again, drip irrigation, that's one of the caveats of drip irrigation. You're only wetting a small portion. I've seen growers since then increasing the number of drippers that you put per vine, and having multiple hoses and stuff like that. And it's all oriented to wetting a smaller portion, a bigger portion of the root system. There are other tools, and that's what I'm gonna focus the last 3 minutes I have. I hope they give me a couple of extra minutes here because I'm gonna need them. When you talk about remote sensing, the new technologies that are coming are allowing growers to do more high-resolution imagery, right? So you see there on those 3 pictures at the bottom, there are 3 different sources of imagery, so to speak, but you notice the differences on canopy size. Really, you don't need much training to see that in a given vineyard you have a lot of variability in terms of vine size. And think about water use. Think about the whole crop coefficient model. How do you capture that, and how are you going to estimate that, right? So a lot of the new technologies that are coming in terms of airborne or satellite imagery at a higher resolution basis, they're oriented to addressing this problem. Subflow, obviously, I really have to commend Fruition for the work they've done making subflow, which is a technology that really has been, Mike Van Babel is back there, so I really have to commend Mike and his father for implementing subflow first on a research scale. I don't know, Mike, you correct me, about 15, 20 years ago, maybe. It's been around for a while. But really what Fruition has done, in my opinion, better than anybody else, is really implementing it at a commercial scale, right? So there's not that many options there for using this type of technology on a commercial scale, the way that Fruition and Dynamax basically offer, right? So it's a very complete, very user-friendly package. And what I'm showing you there is just the difference within a single vineyard in terms of subflow. So this, again, using this higher resolution imagery that I showed you before, we basically selected 2 areas within the same vineyard, very different vine sizes, leaf areas. And you see how within the same vineyard is drip irrigated, so every single vine is getting the same amount of water once the water is turned on. You have differences, significant differences, obviously, needless to say, in subflow. Again, another issue with drip irrigation. Surface renewal is another technology that we have tested and in some cases implemented. Surface renewal meaning that you might implement a station that, again, more localized, sort of weather station, although that's not perhaps the right term, but I'm just going to call it a fancier version of a weather station that has some other sensors that are capturing data for your particular vineyard. In our opinion, it's good to the 2-3 acre level, and it provides high frequency data, right? Same as subflow, you get continuous measurements versus the traditional remote sensing satellite-based methods will only give you a screenshot every week or every other week. Subflow, surface renewal, another big advantage is you get continuous data, so you can see how when you water, the response of the vines, and you can manage accordingly. Canopy temperature is another one that has been around, and again, I'm kind of going over time, so I'm not gonna go too much into detail here. But canopy temperature is another option. There are leaf potometers that measure stomatal conductance available today. Again, they provide a more precise leaf-based, vine-based measurement. What I have there on the graph is the diurnal variation of canopy temperature. As your vines get more stressed, your canopy temperature will increase, in some cases even going above ambient temperature. And in our experience, really the difference between ambient temperature and canopy temperature is what's really important, not perhaps just the absolute number of how hot or cold your canopies are, but what is the difference between the ambient, the air temperature, and the canopy. At the end of the day, I do want to spend 30 seconds, I promised you, on why are we doing all this. And I mentioned briefly the whole dilemma that we have faced for the last 10 years with crop coefficients, right? Managing spatial variability. Because if we measure spatial variability, then hopefully we can come up with some sort of technique to manage against vineyard variability. And today, on a commercial level, on a large scale, we time after time we're facing that the best option we have is to divide blocks in these kind of homogeneous areas, where you have them within each of these areas. You might have a uniform value for crop coefficient or for leaf area for whatever attribute you're following, right? It's definitely not perfect, because we all here know that vineyard variability does not follow row orientation. Most of the time it goes across, right? So when you do this, you're kind of cheating yourself, but it's kind of the best we have today. I do encourage everybody to spend a minute talking to Luis Sanchez, Dr. Luis Sanchez here, who is from our research department, and talking to him about his work with IBM. And it's all oriented to solve this problem, right? So our ideal, best case scenario, 2 years from now or 5 years from now or whatever, I don't want to put Luis on the spot, is to have variable rate irrigation on a commercial level, right? So we can control how much water we apply almost to the vine level, right? As a summary, and I know I've gone 2 minutes over the time, so I don't want to spend too much time here, but there are many methods out there, and people ask me then, so what do we use? And most of the time, my best answer is you're going to have to use a combination of all of the above, so to speak, right? One of the things that I didn't mention, but it is very important to know, is that a lot of these technologies are becoming more available to end users, as I call them. It used to be that you had to download, for example, a satellite image from USGS and have like somebody with a PhD in remote sensing to process them. There are companies like Google, IBM, Amazon, Esri that do that service for you today at a very affordable price, where they do all that processing and they push it through a mobile application so growers can have it. And I'll be happy to discuss that afterwards. But again, there's not a recipe. I think what Fruition is doing is definitely the right approach, but there is not going to be a single approach that works under every single situation. Keep in mind what I show you about the lack of rainfall, the effect of drought long term. They are severe. I think we all have to kind of challenge ourselves a little bit and think about how we're gonna manage our vineyards 5 years from now. Maybe some vineyards will have to get to the extreme of dry farm, but I think all vineyards will have to be using less water than what they're using probably today or what they used 5 years ago. I'm going to leave it as that because I ran run a little bit over. Thank you very much. Really, I want to thank Tivo and the organizing committee as well for inviting me.